I'm Steve McInerney. I'm the Executive Director of POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and welcome you for what we hope will be a productive and enlightening discussion on Egypt today. As all of you know, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah Al-Sisi is visiting Washington this week, and he will meet with President Trump just past noon at the White House today. President Sisi is visiting Washington just as he and his rubber stamp parliament are pushing through a set of constitutional amendments that would expand Sisi's powers and those of Egypt's military and allow Sisi to remain president until at least 2034, when he would turn 80 years old. This would negate what is perhaps the final gain of Egypt's 2011 revolution that's still in place, which is the establishment of term limits for the president. Many of the other gains have been walked back in the years that have passed. President Sisi is here in Washington this week in order to receive a public embrace, which he hopes will send a strong message, a message to Egypt's citizens, to the Egyptian public, also to the international community, to regional powers, and perhaps also a message to elements of his own regime and his own military, some of whom may doubt the stability of his grip on power. He hopes to send a message that Washington supports Sisi, and in reality that Washington supports his brutal authoritarian rule, his brutal repression, and this brazen power grab by amending the Constitution. One of the main purposes of this event this morning is that we'd like to provide a platform for a somewhat different view of Egypt and of President Sisi than is likely to be put forth by the red carpet treatment that he's likely to receive from the White House at lunch today. We're hoping to allow a variety of voices, including a number of members of U.S. Congress, to express their concerns with the direction of Egypt under Sisi, and to show that not all of Washington embraces Sisi's authoritarianism, his repression, nor this anti-democratic power grab. Before turning to some of our other speakers this morning, I'd like to briefly offer a few thanks. First, I would like to thank very much the other 11 organizations that are co-sponsoring this event. We at POMED are very proud to be working with all of them, and it's a diverse group of organizations that demonstrate the breadth of the coalition that share deep concern with the direction of Egypt under Sisi's rule. Those co-sponsoring organizations are Amnesty International, the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, Council for Global Equality, Committee to Protect Journalists, Egyptian Human Rights Forum, the Freedom Initiative, Freedom House, Human Rights Campaign, Human Rights First, Human Rights Watch, and PEN America. And you'll hear from speakers for a number of these organizations today. I'd also especially like to thank the several members of Congress who will be speaking today. We know how busy all of them are, and the fact that as many as 6 or 7 members of Congress are likely to appear today, I think is a sign of just how serious the concern is here on Capitol Hill with what's happening in Egypt. I'd also like to thank the Egyptian citizens in particular who are joining us, including to speak today. It takes courage for Egypt citizens to speak out about their country, courage that's not required for those of us that are foreigners. And so we really appreciate that. And also to thank those Egyptian citizens who are here in the audience as well. Finally, I'd like to thank April Corley, who we hope will be able to join us she's prepared some video remarks. We're actually waiting on some Senate office staff to bring the projector that was supposed to be here this morning. But when that projector arrives, we have some recorded remarks that we hope to show from April Corley, and we're very appreciative of that. I mentioned just a moment ago that not everyone here in Washington is embracing Sisi as President Trump and the White House are. One powerful demonstration of that is a really outstanding letter that was sent by 17 senators just yesterday to the administration, addressed to Secretary of State Pompeo. We have copies of the letter available. I'd like to read just the first couple sentences of this letter. The letter opens by saying that the United States and Egypt have shared a strategic partnership for more than 4 decades, As you prepare for Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's visit this month, it is critical to stress that our partnerships are stronger and more sustainable when rooted in shared values, including democratic governance, political and economic freedom, and fundamental human rights for all citizens. I think that sentiment is one shared very much by our organization and all of our co-sponsors today, and is very much in line with the theme of this morning's event. I'm very pleased to introduce as our first speaker today one of the signatories of this outstanding Senate letter. This is a bipartisan letter signed by 11 Democrats and 6 Republicans. And so I'd like to welcome Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. Senator Van Hollen has been serving in Congress since 2003 in the House and now in the Senate. He's a member of the Senate Appropriations Committee and the ranking member of the Budget Committee. And he's long been an example of a member of Congress in both the House and the Senate who's committed to democratic values in foreign policy. So, Senator. Thank you very much.
Thank you. How are you? Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you and the Project on Middle East Democracy and all the other organizations that bring us here today. On this morning, I'm reminded of the words of the late Senator John McCain, who said, and I quote, "The Egyptian people fought hard for a more prosperous and democratic future. President Al-Sisi should honor their fight for freedom and enshrine basic human rights into law." There was, of course, great hope in Egypt for that kind of blossoming of freedom and rule of law, but President Al-Sisi has taken us in the opposite direction than the direction that Senator McCain called for. And so as President Trump rolls out the red carpet and welcomes President Al-Sisi to the White House, it's important that those of us in Congress speak out about what's really happening in Egypt and what President Al-Sisi is really up to. And I'm pleased that we were able to have that bipartisan letter signed by a good group of senators, because what we say in the letter is our effort to tell the truth as to what's happening in Egypt. We know that Al-Sisi has overseen terrible human rights abuses. He has tortured and killed hundreds and hundreds of Egyptians, and it's reported that over 20,000 Egyptian citizens are currently in jail. There are also, among those who are in jail, 20 American citizens. And so when President Al-Sisi comes to the White House, I hope President Trump will ask him about those 20 jailed American citizens and also ask him about what he's doing to his own people, who is indiscriminately locking up. We also have to speak out against the proposals, the constitutional amendments that President Al-Sisi is trying to push through in Egypt. He already has amassed a lot of power, but this is just another blatant power grab to deny the Egyptian people the opportunity for democracy for decades to come. It would entrench his power by allowing President Al-Sisi to remain in office up to the year 2034. It takes more control out of the hands of civilian courts and puts those decisions into the hands of the military. Essentially, Al-Sisi will be giving himself blanket power to appoint judges, so you'll have no independent judiciary. Provides the military even more power than an already powerful military has with respect to arresting civilians and encroaching in areas of civilian life. And as President Al-Sisi proposes these amendments to further consolidate his power, to further deny people basic freedoms and the rule of law, he's denying any kind of open debate as to how that will happen. So this is not in any way a fair fight over whether or not Egypt and the people of Egypt will adopt these reforms because he's essentially the one with the microphone and with the power, and anybody who speaks up against this will put themselves and their lives and freedom at risk. And so, as the President sees the President Al-Sisi, those of us in Congress believe it's important to stand up, tell the truth, and more than that, to make sure that our values are enshrined in our legislation. Military assistance should not be a blanket, unconditional provision by the American people. And so we will be working on a bipartisan basis here in the Senate and others in the House of Representatives to make sure that we condition U.S. security assistance and other assistance to Egypt on adherence to basic principles of human rights and upon the release of those American citizens who are detained in Egypt. In the past, Congress has written similar restrictions into law, but the administration, the executive branch, has used very broad waiver authority to essentially overcome those requirements. And so as we write the limitations this time, it's going to be very important that we design it in a way that President Trump cannot easily avoid the application of those conditions through any kind of blanket waiver or very broad national security waiver. All of us hope for a good and strong relationship with Egypt. We have an important security relationship, but we need to make sure that relationship is consistent with our values, the promotion of democracy, and adherence to basic human rights and the rule of law. And that is the goal that we have here in the United States Senate on a bipartisan basis. And I want to thank all of you for being part of this discussion. I think it was very important to hold this today so that we get the truth out about what's happening in Egypt, since we're not going to, unfortunately, be hearing that truth coming out of the White House. So thank you all for being part of this.
Thanks very much, Senator Van Hollen. I'm going to introduce now Khaled Abu-Naga. Khaled is a very prominent and accomplished actor and film producer and director. He is, of course, Egyptian. He's been received just numerous awards for his acting and directing, producing for films in Egypt, in the United Kingdom, and here in the United States. He also has had an impressive, long record of commitment to humanitarian and charitable causes. He was appointed, I believe, in 2007 as UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. And recently he has very courageously spoken out about what's happening in his home country of Egypt. He spoke at another event that we were part of a few weeks ago here on Capitol Hill, and since then we've seen a really kind of vile and vicious defamation campaign against him, kind of in the Egyptian state media. And I just want to commend Khaled for, despite those attacks, continuing to be willing to speak out about his own concerns about his country of Egypt. So I'd like to thank Khaled for being here and turn to him for some remarks. As you like.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me today. And I'm an actor, a film producer, I'm an artist, and I never wanted to be an activist. But in 2011, when I felt my country deserves better, and Egyptians started to move to make that dream come true, witnessed by the whole world, I had no choice but to be part of that. And I have never been in my life more proud of anything I've done than just being one of the millions who marched in Tahrir Square, in every street in Egypt, asking for Aish, Hurriya, Adala Ijtimaiya, bread, freedom, and social justice. I would have never thought in my worst nightmares that we end up today with a regime that made sure Egyptians have no bread, no freedom, no social justice, and on top of that, not even dignity, which I think was the first and foremost the most important catalyst that made Egyptians stand up and tell the truth to the world. Today, Egyptians are behind bars. Most of those young people in Tahrir Square, who you were all proud of, the whole world was proud of, are behind bars, in prisons, or behind bars of fear. This is a regime that is trying to make us all be afraid. Just imagine a world with no fear. Just imagine the opposite, that we can have a world where we all agree to appreciate the most important gift we all have, life. And that would be just enough to achieve exactly what President Sisi policies claim they want to achieve. So I'm not going to just condemn the policies today. I'm actually going to give you the road for hope, the spirit of Tahrir Square. I'm going to revisit that because this is why we are all here today. We are living the unfolding and repercussions and retaliations of a very big, seismic historical event, the Arab Spring. None of us will live something of such importance that changed history before and after, I believe. I thought when I talked here on Capitol Hill a few weeks ago, or actually last week, about human rights in Egypt and in the region, I thought that's what actors do. That's what artists, if you're honest to yourself, what you should do. I should be the voice of those who have no voice. And I hope you all agree with that. What will be the risks? I thought I would risk some smear campaigns again, expelled from my union, maybe face even horrific consequences like the Italian student Regini in Cairo, or Khashoggi here in Washington, D.C. Yes. This can risk my life. This can risk a lot, but it's nothing compared to those who are dying right now, those who are tortured right now, those teenagers under the age of 18 having death sentences without proper trials right now. Thousands of those kids, youth, or even adults, what they are facing is nothing at all compared to my personal story. So I'm here on behalf of all those. I'm not here only on behalf of Egyptians, but I would like to be speaking to you on behalf of humanity. As a fellow human being, aching for other fellow human beings at this time and age being forcibly disappeared, incarcerated for a blog or a tweet, court-martialed in absentia, like my fellow actor Amr Wakid, and have a sentence of 7 or 5 years, we're told. fabricating police cases against anybody who has a voice. I am here on behalf of all those. Again, not as an Egyptian, but as a human being. We have a situation in Egypt that needs your attention. Actually, not only you, the EU, the UN, and every peace-loving human being on this planet. History teaches us that if we let dictators grab the power and be unaccountable, they will turn against you who supported them one day. So they keep telling us in Egypt, look at Syria, look at Libya. And I think we should use that narrative, not them. Look at Syria, look at Libya. What happened there? People in power decided that security, that power grabbing is more important than human rights, than freedom, than what people asked for. And we end up with a situation in Syria. We end up with situations in Libya. The stability that the regime of President Al-Sisi in Egypt is claiming is exactly what we want, stability. But we claim that they are taking Egypt in the exactly opposite direction. All the reports coming from the human rights organizations tell us that there is an exceedingly and alarmingly very powerful presence of ISIS, of radical elements in prison jails, looking for those vulnerable youth. The youth that the policies of President Al-Sisi is telling them, the narrative is, nobody cares about you. Not the US, not the EU, nobody cares about you anymore. From being praised as a pride to humanity in 2011 to nobody cares about you. These kids, in their most vulnerable moments, are radicalized. We all remember what terrorists did to us. We, in Egypt, lived that for quite some time. I cannot insist and iterate more than what is happening in Egypt right now is the best environment for radicalization. And last but not least, I just want to stress something very simple. It's a fact that if you make any agreements with this regime, legally, it's deemed invalid and void under the Constitution of Egypt now. Under this Constitution, anything that they are trying to change in the Constitution, including the power grabbing, the terms of the president, which is the only thing we have left from 25th of Jan revolution. This is all going to be void and invalid by the Constitution we have right now. I have more to talk, but for now, I'm going to let you all think about that until I come back to you later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Khaled, for your powerful remarks. Our next speaker was, for many years, a real leader in the human rights and democracy community outside of government. Congressman Tom Malinowski was formerly the Washington director for many years of Human Rights Watch. He went on to serve as the Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And then this past November, all of us in the human rights and democracy civil society community were excited to see one of our own elected, when Tom was elected to represent the 7th District of New Jersey. And he's already, in his first few months on Capitol Hill, shown real leadership on human rights and democracy issues. So thanks very much, Congressman, for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for for having me. Thanks to POMED and Human Rights Watch and all of the organizations that organized this. I see my distinguished successor, Sarah Margon, here. My freshman colleague, Jason Crow. I think Congressman McGovern, the chairman of our Rules Committee, is just outside and will be saying a few words. And I think this is sending a very, very important message about where the United States of America stands on this question. We're here because we know that an American government committed to human rights would not be welcoming to the White House an Egyptian general just at the moment when he is trying to become dictator for life. And we know why President Sisi is here. It's not because he wants to partner with the United States in fighting terrorism or protecting women or religious minorities or peace in the Middle East. He's here for one reason. He's here because he wants to send home pictures, images of himself being treated with dignity and respect so that his people believe that the United States supports what he is doing. And no matter what may be said in private meetings at the White House, that's the image that most Egyptians will see, unfortunately, on their state media, because this small-minded, insecure man does not allow any contrary views to reach his people if he can help it. And we see how fearfully he responds to an actor who may have the temerity just to stand up with us and to speak his mind. And that gives you a great, I think, insight into the mentality of the man who rules Egypt. But again, whatever may be said on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue today, I think it's pretty clear that the president does not speak for the United States. He does not speak for the United States Congress, certainly, in terms of our perception of what is going on in Egypt. The vast majority of us care about the journalists and activists who are in prison in Egypt today. We care about those kids who are being tortured and radicalized in those prisons. We care about American citizens who are being brazenly detained by this regime for nothing more than their associations and political views. We care about April Corley, and we care about the despicable way in which the government of Egypt has treated her, and by extension, the despicable way in which they treat the United States of America. And I think we're smart enough here to understand that in exchange for the favors that Egypt gets from the White House, they don't actually do anything for us. This is not a situation where we're trading off human rights for something that advances the U.S. national interest. Egypt is no longer an influential player in the Middle East. It is entirely dependent on the aid that it receives from wealthier countries in the region and contributes nothing to goals of peace and security. Its military is utterly, disastrously incompetent, in addition to being cruel. And what happened to April Corley is not only outrageous, but it was a window into just how incompetent the Egyptians are in terms of how they use the equipment that we give them. Sending a bunch of F-16s and Apaches to the middle of the western desert to simply shoot at whatever they might see with no intelligence. And it so happens in that case they were shooting at a group of tourists, one of whom was an American citizen who was badly wounded. That happens every day in Sinai. This is how they use the equipment that we give them. The only thing they know how to do well with these F-16s and Apaches is to show them off at parades and air shows that are designed to make the regime look good. They do absolutely nothing to benefit Egyptian security or ours. And as we've heard, the torture, the mistreatment in Egyptian prisons is not only a human rights crisis, it is also radicalizing the next generation of jihadis who will be killing Egyptian civilians and innocent people from other countries. And the fact that we are, or at least the White House is welcoming this guy, In the same week when people in Algeria have expelled their longtime dictator, Bouteflika, and people in Sudan seem to be expelling their longtime dictator, Bashir, just shows how short-sighted our current policy is. Once again, we are investing, we are aligning ourselves with an authoritarian leader whose reign will end badly. We do not know when, we do not know how, but I think we can all say with confidence, based on our knowledge of events in the Middle East in the last few years, that even if President Sisi extends his reign on paper into the 2030s, he is not going to be the leader of Egypt for that long, and it will end very badly for him. And if it ends badly for him and we are associated with him, it will end very badly for us. And so for all those reasons, I think the majority of us who would support a wiser policy, a policy more grounded in American values and interests, are correct. And I would say that just as I don't think President Sisi is going to last very long, I don't think our policy is going to last much beyond this administration. And in the meantime, many of us in Congress are going to express an alternative view. I and others have asked that military aid to Egypt be cut this year. Makes no sense to be giving this military $1.3 billion a year in exchange for the absolute nothing that we get in return. I have also specifically asked that no Apache helicopters be provided to the Egyptian military until we have absolutely full satisfaction from the Egyptian government in the case of April Corley. Why should we give them another Apache helicopter when they use Apaches to maim Americans and do nothing to apologize or to make up for the harm that they cause? So watch what happens in the Congress over the next few months. I think you will see increasing frustration and activism from many of us that I hope will compensate for the very short-sighted policies from the White House. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks very much, Congressman Malinowski. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is a newly elected member of Congress, was elected in November to represent Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. She's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and has quickly become one of the more prominent voices of this new freshman class of representatives. So please join me in welcoming Representative Omar.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's really early, but this is my second speech of the morning already, so this is what Congress is like, I suppose. Thank you so much for having me. As it was said, my name is Ilhan Omar. I am the newest member to represent Minnesota's 5th Congressional District in Minnesota. Really excited to be here with you all. Today, we know that President Sisi is meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office. The Sisi government is imminently pushing through a constitutional amendment that would allow Sisi to stay in power until 2034. That's the beginning of dictatorship. And we must be clear, as many international observers and human rights groups have in warning, that this is a step towards, again, Sisi's dictatorship. Egypt has tens of thousands of political prisoners, even though the government denies there is any. According to Committee to Protect Journalists, Egypt now has the highest number of journalists behind bars, more than anywhere in the country. In addition to journalists, members of political opposition and human rights defenders have also been targeted. This goes against human consciousness. And anyone who cares about human rights and respects international law should speak out against this. And we know that religious minorities, especially the Coptic Christians, have in fact been in more dangerous situations under Sisi than previous administrations. That's why I'm proud co-sponsor of House Resolution 49 to insist on protection for religious minorities in Egypt. Sisi will undoubtedly present his meeting with President Trump as US endorsement for his brazen power grab. But we are here, united, to say no. No ally is above reproach. In a modern, moral, 21st century America, our relationship with Egypt needs to be put under greater scrutiny. We should not be enabling broad-scale human rights violations. We should not continue to send $1.3 billion in aid to Egypt every year without questioning the suppression of speech, of human rights work, and of political dissent. So I hope that everyone here knows that you have allies in the United States of Congress. And we will not stand idly while President Sisi tries to roll back the few remaining gains of the 2011 uprising against Mubarak. And we will continue to show solidarity with those brave Egyptians who continue to struggle for their internationally recognized rights. It's an honor for me to serve in the Foreign Affairs Committee. It's been a point of contentiousness for my time in Congress, but it's one that I proudly take on, because the one thing that I know is that in this particular committee, the issues that come in front of it have been debated for decades. There are few members who have the privilege of serving on that committee that have been directly impacted by every single issue. And it's about time that we have someone like me who understands, not because I have expertise or I went to the best colleges, but because I have directly experienced. So I'm excited to be a partner with you and a partner of justice and peace and for the fight for human rights. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Congresswoman Omar. Our next speaker is Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. He is the Vice Chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, longtime ranking member and Chairman at times of the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee. He served in the United States Senate since 1975, and he has for decades been one of the most important voices in the United States Senate on issues of human rights and democratic values in U.S. foreign policy, globally and also specifically in Egypt. So we're very happy to have Senator Leahy here to share his thoughts with us. Senator.
Thank you, and I'm sorry to be sort of bouncing in and out. I know Chris Van Hollen was here. He and I are supposed to be at the same leadership meeting, but I think we both felt this was a good place to be. And I see my good friend Congressman Jim McGovern, and saw Tom Malinowski, who, when he was at the State Department, had to monitor the Leahy law around the world. I am concerned by the kind of welcome the Egypt's President Al-Sisi will be getting at the White House. He's going to be treated like a legitimate head of state by President Trump. So it's fitting that I think that we all call attention to the things that are happening in Egypt, because you're not going to hear about these things from either President Trump or President Al-Sisi. You know, Egypt is a country, I don't need to tell you, with an extraordinary history and culture. It's been a U.S. ally for many years. My wife and I have visited it many times. It has been a moderating influence in an unstable part of the world, a region where extremism is prevalent. I remember being at the White House when the then President of Egypt and the then Prime Minister of Israel signed the peace agreement. What a difference. What a difference. Under the current president, Egypt has chosen a dangerous path that is typical of paranoid, autocratic regimes. They're faced with a popular undercurrent of desire for greater freedom and opportunity. But last year, political opposition candidates were imprisoned so they could not dilute Al-Sisi's margin of victory in an election that by any measure whatsoever was a total sham. Egypt today is unmistakably a one-party state. The armed services wield near total unchallenged authority, and the press is controlled. It makes a mockery of the idea of a free press. Anyone that comes from a family that had any prior association with the Muslim Brotherhood is automatically labeled a terrorist and imprisoned. Artists and actors like Mr. Naga, writers, students, human rights lawyers, social activists, journalists who dare to criticize the regime are arrested, they're accused of being traitors, they're physically abused. Even Egyptian Americans, Mustafa Qasim, who's innocent of any crime, languish in prison despite efforts by the U.S. Embassy and people like myself to obtain their release, and yet President Trump is welcoming the man who agrees with that imprisonment. April Corley, an American citizen, luckily survived a terrifying attack on her tour group by the Egyptian military that killed 12, injured 8 other innocent people. She suffers from multiple injuries. Her career was ruined. I met with her a week ago. Astounding courage, but a tragic, tragic attack. 3 years later, she's still waiting for compensation from the Egyptian government. This is a government that every year receives $1.3 billion in military aid from the United States. And here this American that their military has injured, and actually injuries will last all her life, and they will not compensate her for the injuries. You know, it's no secret that unfortunately President Trump gets along best with autocrats who rely on repression to stay in power. The President of Egypt is now seeking to change the constitution so he can retain control well for another 25 years. Come on. Come on. This is democracy. He and Venezuelan President Maduro have a great deal in common. Yet one's labeled a tyrant by the White House and the other is a good friend. The irony is that while Al-Sisi is here to meet with his friend in the White House, the Egyptian government-controlled media under his rule has increasingly become a proponent of anti-American propaganda and conspiracy theories. Best friend when he's at the White House, anti-American when he's in Egypt. Give me a break. If Egypt continues in this direction, the future is predictable and it's ominous. Rather than becoming a modern, stable, and prosperous country, which it could, it will become increasingly divided and unstable. By imprisoning anyone who has the courage to call for more freedom of expression and political pluralism, President Al-Sisi is creating a whole new generation of extremists. It's long past time for the U.S. to use our influence with Egypt, including tying our military aid to reforms to protect the fundamental rights of the Egyptian people. Let them know what we stand for. Even if they don't stand for human rights, let them know that we do. If we don't, then we stand complicit with a military dictatorship that contradicts the most basic ideals and principles our country stands for. So I thank Mr. Naga, I thank everybody who has stood up. And as I said, I see people, and my good friend Jim McGovern, who has been a constant voice for democratic ideals around the world, and one who's always stood up for those who've been repressed. And I thank you very much for this time, and I apologize for leaving.
Thanks so much, Senator Leahy, for your powerful remarks. Next, I'd like to welcome Congressman Jim McGovern. He represents Massachusetts' 2nd Congressional District. He's served in Congress since 1997. He's been a longtime co-chair of the Congressional Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. He's also the chair of the House Rules Committee. Congressman.
Well, thank you very much, and I feel privileged to be here with all of you in this room and with some of my colleagues in Congress who you've heard from, as well as Senator Leahy, who's one of my heroes. And so I want to say good morning and thanks to POMED and all the partner organizations that came together to make this event possible. The fact that I am here today in such distinguished company is a testament to Egypt's importance to the United States, but also to the level of concern we in Congress have about the direction that country has been going. Our concern is not new. In 2015, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which I co-chair, held a hearing on human rights in Egypt. We organized the hearing in response to alarming reports of widespread human rights abuses after the 2013 military coup that removed President Morsi, a coup in which Al-Sisi participated and that opened the door to his rise to power. At the time of the hearing, thousands of Egyptian citizens, including politicians, judges, and other civil servants, had reportedly been detained for political dissent. Others had been sentenced to death in mass trials that lacked due process. The free press was being dismantled and terrorist attacks were on the rise. The campaign of repression that was underway was described as surpassing the scale of repression under former President Hosni Mubarak. 3.5 years later, the situation has deteriorated further while Mr. Al-Sisi is trying to consolidate his control for the long run. The constitutional amendments passed by the Egyptian parliament in February are a recipe for institutionalizing authoritarian rule. Just look at what they would do if ultimately approved by referendum. It would strengthen the role of the military as, quote, guardian and protector, end quote, of the state and grant it wider jurisdiction over civilians. It would increase the president's control over the judiciary while weakening its power to review legislation. It would allow Al-Sisi himself to remain in office, as Senator Leahy said, until 2034, which means that a couple of generations could live most of their lives knowing only his rule. What is going on in Egypt is terrible for the Egyptian people, and I believe it is terrible for the long-term stability of the country. Contrary to what the Trump administration seems to believe, repressing people is not good strategy in the fight against terrorism. For those who haven't seen it, I recommend the new report from Human Rights First on ISIS's growing power in Egyptian prisons thanks to the torture that is radicalizing young men. One of the things that most concerns me as a U.S. citizen and as a member of Congress is the inconsistency of the administration's policy toward the spread of authoritarianism, which is a growing global problem. You know, when it comes to Egypt, an ally, creeping authoritarianism and the brutal human rights violations that come with it get a pass. And I expect that neither will merit a mention when President Trump and Al-Sisi meet today. And as President Leahy hinted, sadly, the United States, when it comes to human rights, sends mixed signals. When it comes to our adversaries, say Venezuela or Iran, the administration can't say enough to criticize those countries. But when it comes to Egypt and when it comes to other countries that the president wants to make nice with, he says nothing. We need a reset. We need a reset. Systematic human rights violations and the rise of strong men should concern us always and everywhere. We need to return to the days when the United States led diplomatically in strong support of human rights and democracy without punishing citizens in the process. The ongoing human rights abuses and the turn toward authoritarianism in Egypt should be top concerns for the United States foreign policy, both because repression on such a scale is morally wrong and because instability in Egypt is not in the U.S. interest. We must find a way to pursue common objectives with our allies without turning a blind eye to fateful errors. So I believe that we must condition and withhold military aid to Egypt until the Egyptian government makes meaningful reforms to its human rights practices. We should impose targeted global Magnitsky sanctions on the individuals responsible for the worst abuses, and we must think creatively about the leverage we have and measures we can take to encourage the Egyptian government to change course. Let me just say finally that, and I say this with regard to Congress and with regard to this administration, you know, those of us in the United States have to make a decision whether we actually stand for human rights, whether it's important, whether it's a centerpiece of our foreign policy or not. And I know it's uncomfortable to speak about human rights when it comes to an ally or somebody we've had a good relationship with over the years. But the bottom line is, I think we have to, because if we stand for anything in this country, we must stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And what is happening in Egypt is unconscionable. We need to do better, and we all need to speak with one voice. And I thank you very much for being here.
Thanks very much, Congressman McGovern. Next, I'd like to welcome Congressman Jason Crow. He represents Colorado's 6th Congressional District. He was just elected in November. He's also a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Congressman.
Thank you very much for having me here today. We stand here today because the administration's decision to welcome President Sisi to the White House under these circumstances and with recent actions flies in the face of our values of democracy, political and economic freedom, and human rights. And it just reinforces this administration's continued trend and preference for autocrats and dictators over our more free and democratic partners. As an Army Ranger in Afghanistan, I saw what happens when people no longer believe their government is responsive to the people and fails to represent them. A lack of transparency and accountability in a political process doesn't just breed corruption. It can cause a seismic shift and loss of faith. And that loss of faith has serious national security repercussions, breeding instability and, in many cases, violence. In the case of Egypt, we must make sure this does not happen again. The Arab Spring showed us just how much Egyptians share our values of democracy, human rights, and equality. Yet President Sisi has continued to pursue policies that fly in the face of that, limiting the independence of the judiciary, restricting opposition parties, and marginalizing women and minorities. It is time now to stand up for our country's values and to call out Sisi's anti-democratic power grab. You see, in the last 8 years, a very disturbing trend has started to occur. It was the end of an almost 70-year process of the expansion of democracy and human rights. We entered, around 2011, a democratic recession. We reached a tipping point where the expansion of democracy ended and it started to contract. And it is more important than ever in this time that we stand firm behind our values and our principles. We will continue to speak up and stand up here on Capitol Hill. In the absence of that strong leadership message out of the White House, rest assured that those of us in Congress and Capitol Hill will stand firm based on our values and our democratic principles. Senator Van Hollen said it really well this morning when he said that we have to look closely at the actions of our security partners, and we can't undermine the intent of those relationships by turning a blind eye to the actions of those security partners. Put more simply, so long as I am in Congress and on the Armed Services Committee, We will not turn a blind eye to the actions of our partners. We will hold people accountable for their actions. And military assistance will not be unconditional. So I will end with a very simple message to our friend Khalid and others. You are not alone. The people of Egypt are not alone. The people of America stand with you. We will not allow our democratic values and principles and democracy to die here at home and throughout the world. We will stand firm together, shoulder to shoulder, as we move forward and fight for what we believe in, what we know is right. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Congressman. I just want to thank all of the 6 members of Congress that have spoken this morning. I think that their words have been a very powerful rebuke from the embrace that we expect to see at the White House at lunchtime today. Our next speaker, I mentioned a bit earlier, and several of the members of Congress who've spoken have referred to her. April Corley, she's not able to be here with us in person, but she has prepared a short video message for us to share with you all. As has been mentioned, in September 2015, she was on vacation in Egypt with her boyfriend and a number of others when their tour group was bizarrely and brutally attacked by the Egyptian military using a U.S.-issued Boeing Apache attack helicopter. At this time, I'll share this video of April relating her story firsthand and also asking President Trump to take action as he meets with President Sisi today.
Hello, my name is April Corley. I want to thank the Project on Middle East Democracy for giving me the opportunity to share my story. I was living my dream. My life was about glitter and rhinestones and roller skates. I was an Olympic caliber athlete. I was the United States national champion for roller skating. I was silver medalist at the Pan American Games, and I represented the United States 5 times at the World Championships. That led me into an entertainment career. I was roller skating on film, in TV, music videos, and commercials, working with celebrities like Madonna and Katy Perry. Then I went on vacation to Cairo with the man that I love, Raphael, and he told me that he had a surprise for me at the end of the trip, but that never happened. We were traveling in the Western Desert, going from Cairo to the Bahariya Oasis, and we stopped to have lunch with the group. I was doing cartwheels in the sand, and Raphael was taking my picture. Then it started raining bullets and rockets on us. It was a horrific sight. I saw a black ring in the sand, and there was blood everywhere, and I have multiple injuries all over my body. The shots seemed to keep going for hours, as if they were trying to destroy everything in sight. About 12 people died, including my boyfriend Raphael, and everyone in the tour was injured. Egypt called it a mistake, but this to me was a massacre. I've since had lengthy hospitalizations for months at a time, a number of surgeries and dozens of medications and hundreds of appointments. I still have shrapnel in my body and I need more surgeries. I'm in chronic pain and I have severe PTSD. I spend my days going to appointments and just trying to take one step at a time. My doctors say that I'll never completely recover and that I won't be able to work again. Like I said before this, I was an Olympic caliber athlete, and now I have trouble just taking care of myself. It turns out that I learned that the weapons used in the attack were Boeing Apache helicopters, a weapon that U.S. taxpayers, including myself, helped to fund through military assistance to Egypt. I now understand that the U.S. is about to sell another 10 Apaches to Egypt, and I've been in Washington, D.C. this week, meeting with so many people who have supported me, including POMED. many in Congress and at the State Department. I'm especially grateful to Secretary Pompeo, Senator Leahy, and Chairwoman Lowy. All I've been asking for is to be fairly compensated for what Egypt did on that terrible day. I'm only asking for what anyone in this situation would receive. It's shocking to me that the U.S. is about to sell another 10 Boeing Apaches to Egypt, the very same weapon that attacked our tour group that day. My hope is that President Trump won't sell the new Apaches until Egypt takes responsibility for what it did. And I hope that what happened to me never happens to anyone ever again. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to address all of you.
I had the opportunity, along with some of my colleagues last week, to meet with April, and her story is such a powerful and devastating one, and it's extremely important. And the pain and suffering that she has been put through by the Egyptian regime, by the Egyptian military, using U.S. taxpayer-funded equipment, is just unimaginable. In speaking with her, what I found to be perhaps the most horrifying detail of just this really horrendous attack in the Egyptian desert was that Egyptian military helicopters, after targeting the tour group, they continued to circle back repeatedly, hovering over the group of mostly dead tourists in the sand, and continuing to fire on them from lunchtime until sundown. It's just utterly horrifying. And unfortunately, I feel that in a number of ways this attack is not entirely an aberration, but in some ways is representative of the grotesque incompetence and brutality of the Egyptian regime. It appears that initially this attack was the result of incompetence, of seeing a group of people in the desert that, despite being a tour group, plainly marked with a tour bus and accompanied by a police escort, that they mistakenly, the pilots may have mistakenly imagined that they were somehow a threat or a terrorist group. But it appears that most likely, after they realized their mistake, because they came back and the helicopters hovered over the scene many times, and it appears that they realized their mistake, and their instinctive reaction was to try to kill all of the remaining tourists so that no one would be left alive to testify as to their brutal mistake in the first place. This is just utterly horrifying, and for this to be done with U.S. not even sold but granted military equipment should be completely unacceptable to all of us as U.S. citizens. And I think that it also is representative of how the Egyptian military handles itself in a number of situations. We know of April's story because she, against all odds, survived this unconscionable attack by playing dead in the sand for a number of hours while after seeing her boyfriend and a number of other companions murdered next to her. But we will never know the stories of many other Egyptians also killed brutally by the Egyptian military using American equipment. Stephen Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations authored an excellent piece that I'd recommend that was published yesterday by Foreign Policy magazine about April and her horrible case. And I'd just like to quote one piece from it. He concludes his piece by saying that the Egyptian government cannot simultaneously declare itself open for the tourist trade, demand that U.S. taxpayers fund its American-made arsenal, nearly kill an American citizen tourist with a piece of that arsenal, and then callously ignore the suffering of that American. I think that sums up our position quite well. I'd also just like to mention that we have copies available of a powerful op-ed that April authored herself, available outside the room, that was published by Fox News on their website last week. I'd like to turn now to Julie Dorff. Julie is a longtime leading human rights activist and especially an activist on behalf of LGBTQ rights. And she now represents the Council for Global Equality, where she serves as a senior advisor. So, Julie.
First of all, welcome. Hi, everybody. And thank you, Steve, a ton, and to POMED for organizing today's event. A couple weeks ago, President Bolsonaro was in town, and after this stream of autocrats that our president keeps meeting with, it just feels incredibly important to be standing here together with my other colleagues in the human rights space, and together with policymakers who believe strongly that this should not be what our country represents, and to kind of reclaim the values of human rights as a central focus of what this country stands for. So thank you again for creating this space. The Council for Global Equality is a 30-member organization of U.S. groups, human rights, and LGBT organizations that focus on our U.S. foreign policy and how it impacts this particularly vulnerable group around the world. And as we have heard today about the tens of thousands of Egyptian citizens who are in prison, among them, there are hundreds of LGBT Egyptians who have been randomly put in jail for just the way they look or act. Many of them have been entrapped through the internet, but at this point, most of them are being just arbitrarily arrested on the streets because of their perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. What makes this particularly vulnerable group and their treatment in Egypt even more horrific is the fact that the vast majority of them are subject to forced anal exams by forensic medical authorities. Thankfully, as of last year, the State Department has stopped funding the Forensic Medical Association of Egypt, which used to be an additional way that our government supported this form of torture, not on purpose, but in an attempt to create a better judicial system. But this practice continues. And as we've heard today, a number of incredibly important interventions that our government and our Congress needs to consider. I was very happy to hear Congressman McGovern discuss the Global Magnitsky Act. It is imperative that we use this in as robust a way as possible, and that members of Congress consider Global Magnitsky sanctions for those medical authorities who are engaging in forced anal exams. This is perceived of, I would call it medicalized rape, but it is a legally sanctioned sexual assault against the will of these individuals, and it needs to be considered a form of torture, and it needs to stop. Egypt isn't the only country that engages in forced anal exams, but the international community needs to condemn this in the strongest form, and Congress needs to use GLOMAG sanctions as well on these Egyptian authorities. The many things that will not be said today in the Oval Office, but these arbitrary arrests need to stop now. The anal exams need to stop. The detaining of transgender people, and particularly transgender women in male prisons, needs to stop. Today, Malak Al-Kashef, an activist who happens to be a trans woman, is currently being detained and treated unwell in a male prison. Her case needs to be brought to our attention. We need to uphold the freedom of expression, both in public, but also in private over the internet. That should not be a place where people are entrapped and taken to jail. I think I'll end there, but I thought it was important to bring the perspective of a particularly voiceless and particularly vulnerable community. The LGBT community all over the world is often the canary in the coal mine, the first to kind of be subject to issues that many parts of civil society or or the opposition forces are, how they're treated. And this has been going on for many years, even prior to Al-Sisi, but it has gotten extraordinarily worse in the past, since 2013, 14, under this regime. So thank you again for bringing us all together here today.
Thanks, Julie. Next, I'd like to turn to Motaz al-Faqiri. Motaz is a longtime leading Egyptian human rights defender, human rights activist, who I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with for many years. He's worked for a number of organizations, and he's currently one of the founding members and the general coordinator of the Egyptian Human Rights Forum. Motaz.
Thank you very much. I think I have to say that it's really emotionally touching to see this extraordinary level of solidarity from congressmen and women today and from our partners here in Washington. This gives us hope and makes us determined to continue our struggle despite all danger and risk that we see in Egypt today. I have to start my speech today by expressing solidarity with my friends and colleagues inside Egypt, human rights defenders and political activists who struggle against this autocratic constitutional amendment. Most of them are working under very hard conditions that we have never seen in Egypt since, I think I have to say, in modern time. We haven't seen this reckless, repressive, and unqualified ruler who work hard to re-engineer Egypt, not just into a repressive regime, but into a totalitarian regime, using law, institutions, re-engineering institutions, including the judiciary, which has been transformed into a platform for reprisals against human rights defenders and political activists, using militarization of different aspects of society, media institution, education institution, business landscape as well. Under Sisi's influence of military in the business and economic sector has significantly increased. And you know that the budget of the military is not under public scrutiny. Today, Egypt facing imminent threat in its stability and the cohesion of the society. And it's unfortunate to see international actors, including American administration, to adopt a very short-sighted and narrow interest approach toward Egypt, which actually does not only expose the stability of Egypt into danger, but also the stability of the whole Middle East and Europe, as well as the United States. My colleagues spoke about the increasing level of radicalization among young people in Egypt. They referred to the recent report of Human Rights First, and many other reports coming also from Egyptian media and Egyptian activists who testify how Egyptian prison fuel radicalization among Egyptian youth. These challenges cannot be confronted with security approach to Egypt, but human rights, civil society should be at the top of priority of any foreign policy toward Egypt today. My concern as an Egyptian citizen that this current government in Egypt, with its effort to devoid society from all moderate and liberal alternatives, would expose the social stability into a real threat over the coming future, in the midterm and long-term future. I think civil society play a key role in safeguarding the stability of this society. Khalid Abu Naga talked about the lesson learned from the Arab Spring, the theory that has been propagated for years in Western societies and among governments that strong men are needed to protect stability, I think has fallen in the Arab Spring. We saw what happened in Libya, we saw what happened in Yemen, we saw what happened in Syria and in Iraq, and all of these countries ruled by strong men. But they actually, once they fall, these strong men, intractable problems coming into surface, and the international community starting to manage this contradiction and to manage and maintain dangers coming from these countries. So I think it's today more than any time before that human rights should be a priority in the relationship with Egypt. Egyptian human rights movement has been under systematic attack since 2011, when President Sisi was the director of the military intelligence. We have to remember that this campaign against human rights defenders started from this year, attacking international human rights group and then starting to attack local and Egyptian human rights group. My friend in Egypt today, most of them are not able to travel. Their personal and institutional assets have been frozen. Their families have been subjected to reprisal and retaliation. Some of them are in prison just for defending human rights, for working on enforced disappearance. They become also victims of enforced disappearance, and there are too many examples that we can talk about. So this is the message that I would like to say today, and taking this forum to urge American administration, congressmen and women, to work for the Egyptian people, for the aspiration of Egyptian people toward freedom, justice, and social justice. This is something that needs to be done today before Egypt turns into any stable society, and at that time, international community will work to manage instability and to contain risk coming from Egypt. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Motaz. Obviously, so many of the remarks today are kind of tough to listen to about the just extremely difficult situation inside Egypt. I just want to comment on, amid all of that, how inspiring it is to see activists like Motaz and Egyptian citizens like Khaled who are committed and so passionate about bringing about positive change to their country despite this very serious risk that they face for doing so. And it's beyond those that are here with us today, but both Motaz and Khaled have traveled to Washington to speak at this event today. And they represent a much broader community of Egyptian citizens and activists. And it's a truly inspiring community that we have the opportunity to work with. Our next speaker will be Sarah Margon. Sarah worked for a number of years here in the Senate for one of the leading champions for human rights in Egypt in the Mubarak era, Senator Russ Feingold. And she now, as Congressman Malinowski mentioned earlier, has become his successor as the Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. So we're very happy to have Sarah with us. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here and just thrilled that Human Rights Watch can be a co-host of this important event. So thanks to POMED for leading us. This is an important moment for us all to stand together, and this is definitely an Egyptian struggle, but it's also our struggle too, in part because of the strong U.S.-Egyptian alliance, but in part because these are the basic fundamental rights that everybody wants, everybody deserves. And I think we saw that strongly and clearly in 2011, but for many years, the Egyptian human rights community has been vocal, has been active, and has been leading the way throughout the region to push for more dignity and a government that respects their rights. The human rights situation, as you've heard, in Egypt is dire, surpassing in state violence and repression what we saw in the Mubarak era. President Al-Sisi's government has increasingly invoked terrorism and the country's state of emergency law to silence peaceful activists. Human Rights Watch and many other organizations have documented scores and scores of cases where these peaceful activists have been thrown in jail, arbitrarily detained, tortured. Sometimes it is secular activists, sometimes it is members of the Muslim Brotherhood, sometimes it is young people under 18, sometimes it is members of the Coptic community or the LGBT community. Sisi is not protecting his people, he's preying on his people. We've documented scores of cases of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings of detainees. The Egyptian army's counterterrorism campaign is, I think, as Steve said, grotesquely incompetent and brutal and likely counterproductive, creating thousands of people who have been forcibly evicted from their homes with no compensation and are increasingly unsympathetic to the army and their approach to, quote unquote, fighting terrorism. We're looking at a fragile security situation across the country that can explode at any moment. So it's against this backdrop that Sisi comes to Washington to shore up support for his proposed constitutional amendments. And let's be clear, these are amendments that will not only centralize power, but they will crush the rule of law, remove space for peaceful dissent, and ultimately institutionalize repression, at least until 2034, but likely longer. We know, particularly those of us that work in this community and have been doing so over decades, that trade-offs are the norm when it comes to US diplomacy. We understand there's a give and take when it comes to human rights, national security, and economic concerns. But the Trump administration has taken this to a completely new level. It's ignoring or disregarding the facts and providing robust support to autocrats the world over. Today, we will see the same thing when President Sisi is welcomed to the White House, as he models the Egyptian government in his own image, not in the image of the Egyptian people. This is not the kind of government that deserves $1.3 billion with no strings attached. This is the kind of government that needs more scrutiny, not less. Anything other than strong and consistent messages will be seen as support for this brazen power grab and will diminish rather than increase US leverage. I think many of the lawmakers that were here today made that very clear, and I'm so pleased to hear them say that they will use their congressional authorities and push for a more balanced US-Egypt policy. What the United States says and does matters in Egypt. We know that's true because Sisi is here today. Let's make it count, not in the way that President Sisi wants it to count, but in a way that counts for the Egyptian people, for the 60,000 that are behind bars on political grounds, for the many that are here in support of a better Egypt who went to Tahrir Square in 2011. Let's roll out the red carpet, not just for President Sisi and a government, for the people of Egypt who actually deserve to have that red carpet rolled out. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to welcome, to give remarks, Tom Melia. Tom is the Washington Director for PEN America. He formerly served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And most importantly, at least to me, he also serves as the chair of the Board of Directors of our organization, POMEN.
Thanks, Steve. And thanks to all of you for coming out this morning. As others have said, it's important that we stand in solidarity with the people of Egypt in opposition to the increasingly repressive regime that has installed itself over the people of Egypt. And while I could go on and go through a list of actors and writers and novelists and poets who have been imprisoned unjustly in Egypt and remain so today, it occurs to me that as speaking for an organization of writers, I was reminded walking down the hall here, I passed by the room I used to work in many years ago when I worked for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan on this corridor. And it was a phrase that he would say when he was trying to get us younglings to be more precise in using the word, the written word. And he would say, ideas matter and words count. And so I want to touch on two words that I've heard this morning and that we use all too casually when we talk about Egypt and the American relationship with Egypt. One of them is the word president. Let's be clear, the man who's going to be embraced at the White House today should be referred to as Generalissimo Al-Sisi, not President Al-Sisi. He came to power in a military takeover that ousted a civilian president who, despite his many, many flaws, had been elected in the freest and most competitive election that Egypt has ever had. And what he's done since then is to ride roughshod over the pretense of constitutional procedure, eliminating all public debate, legislative deliberation, and this constitution that is being steamrollered through in the coming weeks is the antithesis of a political or democratic process. And so I would like us all to refer to Mr. Al-Sisi as General Al-Sisi and not President Al-Sisi. Another word that's used way too casually in this context is the word alliance. The American-Egyptian alliance. Egypt is a problem case for American foreign policy. It's not a country with whom we are joined together in defending against a common enemy. We're not defending Egypt from Israel. We're not defending Egypt from Libya. We're not defending Egypt from its other neighbors like we do in a real alliance where we share values and institutional structures. Egypt is a country that U.S. foreign policy has had to manage for decades, and it costs a lot of money to do so, costs a lot of aggravation, but it's not really an alliance. The people of Egypt are people that we could get along with, do business with. We have a deep and long shared history with the Egyptian people, but with this government, like too many of its predecessors, we don't have an alliance. We have transactions, and we have arrangements, and we have a management of a country that is increasingly incompetent at governing, insecure, and making its own security worse. And so I would like to just make that suggestion today, speaking on behalf of PEN America, PEN as in mightier than the sword, that we should be more careful in the words we use when talking about Egypt and our relationship with it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tom. Next, I'd like to invite Neil Hicks. Neil is a longtime human rights activist who's worked on human rights issues in Egypt for several decades. He now is the Senior Director for Advocacy with the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies. Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies is one of the oldest and most important independent human rights organizations that's indigenous to the Arab world. And POMED's very proud to have worked with the Cairo Institute in many ways for many years. So.
An independent human rights organization with a regional focus that was forced to move its main office away from Egypt in 2014 when President Sisi assumed power. That was because of a level of persecution and threat from the state against the organization made it impossible for us to carry out the work we have been doing since 1993. The leaders of the Cairo Institute became subjects of criminal investigation under Case 173 of 2011, the so-called foreign funding case, a wide-ranging prosecution that has suffocated the human rights movement in Egypt. My colleagues were faced with death threats, personal asset freezes, and the assets of the organization were also threatened. The director of our Cairo office today, he's been under a travel ban since May 2016, and he faces criminal charges that could result in his imprisonment for life. And yet he and his colleagues in Cairo continue to work. And our colleagues in the Egyptian human rights movement, as Mortez mentioned, they have faced worse. Activists have been targeted for enforced disappearance, and some are serving long prison terms on trumped-up charges after unfair trials. A government that takes such severe measures against peaceful activists who promote universal values and the rule of law must have something to hide. And in Sisi's case, it is a shameful record of brutality, intolerance, and repression unprecedented in Egypt's modern history. By welcoming President Sisi to the White House today, President Trump is giving America's blessing to a government that has killed thousands of its political opponents, imprisoned tens of thousands, practiced extrajudicial killing and enforced disappearances in the manner of Latin American dictatorships of an earlier era. And it has mounted a sustained assault on Egypt's institutions, its judiciary, the media, its legislature, and its electoral processes. The proposed constitutional amendments are only a further blow against the already weakened checks on Sisi's absolute power. And Sisi's visit today illuminates a disturbing global trend. By uncritically embracing autocrats and dictators, the Trump administration is giving leaders like President Sisi a free pass to increase their repression and further their own interests. As others have described, Sisi is taking advantage of America's failure to stand for justice, human rights, and freedom, to make himself effectively president for life, to undermine judicial independence, and to increase the already oversized powers of the Egyptian military. And whose interest does this serve? Not the Egyptian people, and not the United States government, which should have learned by now that alliances with Middle Eastern dictators rarely work out well. While the administration is abdicating its responsibilities to speak out for human values, it is incumbent on Congress to fill the void. It is therefore very welcome to see the members of Congress here today, and members from both parties expressing concerns about human rights violations in Sisi's Egypt. We urge them to use their voices and their powers to let the Egyptian people know that the United States has not abandoned them in their struggle for dignity, rights, and freedom, and to put the Sisi regime on notice that its persistent disregard for basic human rights will have consequences in those areas, such as military assistance, where Congress wields influence. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil. Next, I'd like to welcome Rob Bershinsky. Rob is the Senior Vice President for Policy for Human Rights First. He formerly served as the Director for Security and Human Rights Policy at the National Security Council and also as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Rob.
Steve and POMED, let me just add my voice to the chorus of thanks for putting on such an excellent event today. It's really an honor to be here with activists from both Egypt and the United States. It's really an all-star program that you've put together, so thank you. I'll be brief. I want to tell the story of a single man, an Egyptian activist named Mohammed Nabil. Mohammed spoke recently in Cairo to a researcher from my organization, Human Rights First, who is there working on a report that's been mentioned a couple of times this morning on how the extreme repression under Al-Sisi is driving Egyptians into the hands of groups like ISIS. Mohammed had just before been released from prison, where he had been held for peaceful political activity. And here's what he said in his own words. Within the prison, the Liberal and Muslim Brotherhood detainees are held together, and there's a separate cell for the ISIS prisoners. After an altercation with a guard, I was placed in the ISIS cell as a form of punishment. Other prisoners were exposed to ISIS in this way by being put in their cell, often straight after they were tortured. The torture included electric shocks, either with an electric baton or just with 2 wires plugged into the wall and held against bare skin. I was forced to watch detainees being tortured in this way, including a teenager. Some of the detainees were raped with an electric baton. Others were suspended from the ceiling and electrocuted. I saw that happen. In the ISIS cell, I met a guy they called the Prince of Sinai. He told me that a few years before, the Egyptian Air Force had struck his house in Sinai, killing his wife and children, and leaving his body burnt all along one side. He said he was arrested and tortured by Egyptian security authorities and held for over a year. As soon as he left jail, he immediately joined ISIS because of what had happened to him. I was in a cell with another guy from Cairo who had previously been a peaceful protester. But he was detained for 2 years, mostly in solitary confinement. When he joined our cell, he told me he had been tortured grievously and that he had joined ISIS. End quote. We at Human Rights First have spoken to many former prisoners, just like Mohammed, who tell similar stories. An American security partner with whom the United States shares a stated common interest in fighting terrorism is in fact willingly and knowingly creating the very conditions in which terrorism thrives. The effects of this state of affairs are already quite real for millions of Egyptians, thousands of Egyptians, men and women like Mohammed. That is in and of itself a tragedy. But to those who would say, why should I care? A group that apparently includes the current occupant of the Oval Office, we say because while you may not care about the abuse heaped on innocents, you should care about threats to Egyptian and American security driven by this abuse. It's real, and it's only a matter of time before the chickens come home to roost. So that's why I've been heartened this morning to hear voices like those of Senator Leahy and Senator Van Hollen and the other members of Congress that we've heard from. Because the United States, the most powerful nation on the planet, doesn't have to sit idly by. And we certainly don't have to applaud a security partner that takes actions that run contrary to our interests. Congress, as we heard this morning, has the power to send a powerful signal to the Egyptian government that our aid does not constitute a literal blank check. Now it needs to act on that power, and in part based on what we've heard today, I'm modestly hopeful that it will. Men and women like Mohammed and their families certainly deserve as much, and the same certainly goes for American taxpayers and those who one day may be called upon to respond to a foreseeable, man-made threat nurtured one humiliation, one electrocution, or one beating at a time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob. I'd like to invite our final speaker of the day to come forward, Sharif Mansour. Sharif is another longtime Egyptian human rights activist. He's currently the Middle East and North Africa Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Well, thank you all for coming today, and thank you for POMED and all the partners who pulled this last minute. And before I can start, I think there are two things I want to hear everyone to know. One, it's Sisi who is trying to change reality under the pretense of two things: counterterrorism and false news or fake news. Those are the two narratives that you can see across our region in the Middle East have been used in many ways to go back to the pre-Arab Spring period. And for the US Congress here to play a role is important, not just because we have a strong relationship with Egypt, it's because we have Donald Trump as president here. He's the champion of the narrative of false news, and it is the narrative that Egyptian President Sisi have used since 2015 to charge activists, journalists, and anyone who tries to stop and clarify the truth of what's happening in Egypt. And one of the things that Representative Ilham Omar said today is that Egypt was the world's leader in jailing journalists under false news charges. That's 19 journalists out of 25 last year in jail. Some of those journalists basically are never seen any evidence against them in court. Nothing was brought specific to them. They were held in mass trials. And even if they were released, to this day, they are required to go at 6 p.m. every day to go and spend their night in jail, to keep them in check, to keep them from saying the truth. So when we say that today President Trump is going to say all the nice things about President Sisi and move on, what we're saying is basically replacing reality with false news, giving into the narrative that President Sisi will use in order to maintain power until 2015. I want to finish with 3 cases. One, an Egyptian journalist who dared publish and merely translating a New York Times op-ed about the election, which Sisi organized, a farcical election that he ran against no one and won with 90+% of the vote, same way we had seen in Egypt for decades. This guy basically was detained, his organization was shut down, his website was blocked, he was charged with false news, and after the court found him innocent of the charge, he was rearrested without being let outside of jail and put on the same charge, false news in another case. And to this day, now almost more than a year after this article was published, the New York Times to this day gets called false or fake news here by Trump administration. Possibly they and others face consequences for basically speaking up and criticizing Trump, but nothing compared to what happens to anyone in Egypt who does the same. This report about the election fraud is one report that maybe could see some of the shortcomings of the election, but across the spectrum, an Egyptian, Washington, D.C. based researcher and writer whom is a friend for many of us here, who wrote and researched for the National Endowment for Democracy, a congressionally funded organization, who spent time even writing and researching exclusively, specifically about counter-terrorism efforts in Sinai, using U.S. equipment, U.S. support, and U.S. money, and saying it's effortless in a way that it makes terrorism worse and it doesn't solve the problem. He's now in jail after being put in a military trial, handed 10 years sentence, and no one knows what's going to happen to him to this day, Ismail Skandarani. These are just two examples of how the Egyptian government is trying to replace reality with fake, false accusation that becomes stamped with approval, not just by people inside Egypt who support his regime, but people who he met outside, including President Trump, like what we will see today. These are the realities that we have to face. The Congress, US lawmakers have to stand up and speak faced with such relationship that doesn't include any truth and it doesn't bring any justice or accountability, including for US citizens, for US residents, and for journalists and researchers who's trying to shed light on what happens with US tax dollar and what happens with US support on the ground in Egypt. Thank you very much for the opportunity again.
Thanks, Sharif, and thanks again to all of our speakers. We have just a few minutes left. I'd like to open up for a couple of quick questions from the audience. I'm afraid that we don't have a microphone for the audience, so I just ask you to keep your question brief, and I'll repeat it through the microphone so that everyone can hear. I don't know if everyone could hear very clearly, but just to summarize very briefly, he was asking about the horrific treatment of women inside Egypt. He mentioned the horrible virginity tests that were used and became prominent in 2011, and also mentioned issues of sexual harassment and other issues faced by women inside Egypt, which appear to be becoming worse.
Yes, I would agree. I think we're looking, part of the reason I mentioned the LGBT and Q and the Coptic community is because it is often the most vulnerable communities that get attacked early and consistently when you're looking at a machinery of repression. But I would also, of course, put women in that context. I think what we're seeing is across the board, there is no discrimination in terms of who this government is willing to repress. It is anybody who expresses dissent, tries to criticize, tries to assemble, tries to protest or dissent. In the case of women, there is already something of a culture of repression, a lack of gender equality. And so, yes, it is also significantly difficult for the female community as well. But we are looking at the totality of the repression in a lot of our work. And so it is horrifically consistent in terms of just how heavy-handed the authorities are right now across the board.
I think it's an important point because what we hear in United States and many European capitals that President Sisi protect women and Christian, and this is not true. Based on the report produced by Egyptian and international human rights organization, President Sisi has a shameful record in dealing with women, and you mentioned virginity test, but also we need to remember that leading women human rights defenders in Egypt today are subjected to smear campaign stigmatization, targeting their work on rights of women. As they are under travel bans, their assets have been frozen as well. So we see that also in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Mohammed bin Salman also marketed himself as someone who liberate women, but in home, he jail and try women human rights defenders. So this is a contradiction that we try to refute and to confront with another narrative, of course.
Another question? Yeah. I don't know, I think everyone could probably hear the question, but just in brief, it was about efforts to send the same kind of messages that we've seen today beyond Washington, outside of Washington, to Americans in other parts of the country.
As I started today speaking, I said I'm an actor, I'm a producer, I do film, and I usually like my art to speak for anything I want to express. But when it comes to young people who everybody was praising in 2011 being thrown into jail, incarcerated, enforced disappearing, and death sentences, and these horrific smear campaigns, just because people have a different opinion, I think this is the time where we cannot wait for art to speak, and we need to use everything and anything we can to speak out and make sure the whole world is aware of this horrific Pinochet-like system being supported by now, lately, European and American governments. Unfortunately, yes, I will not stop. And it's not because the system is actually after me or Amru Eked or other actors or other poets and writers. It's because that we reached a point where this unprecedented attack on humanity in Egypt for either incompetence. I'm not a believer in the evil of axis of evil. I don't believe that people are evil. It's just that I think that they don't know better. Their only way of solving solutions is by security, taking people out of their homes so that it's secure, which to me is preposterous. You're supposed to protect those people, not remove them from their houses or homes and demolish their houses and all that. So it's just basically, I feel it's complete incompetence, and we need to give them another, or at least give the world the awareness of what's going on, and give the world and the Egyptian people the voice that they are trying to reach out for all of us, so that we can move on. Yes, I'm going to speak to the UN, I'm going to speak to the EU, I'm going to speak soon in Paris in a press conference as well. So I'm not going to be, I'm not going to stop talking.
Thanks very much. We're just about out of time. I'd just like to end with a few brief closing remarks. I think we've heard very powerful testimony today from 6 members of Congress, from many courageous Egyptian citizens, and from many of our other speakers about just how difficult the current situation is in Egypt under Sisi's rule. And I think that heightens just kind of the importance of this moment in which Egypt has been already living under kind of the most brutal period of repression in its modern history. And Sisi is now here in Washington to seek support for expanding his powers and extending this brutal period of his rule all the way until 2034. And I think that's a depressing prospect, and one that I'm heartened to hear many members of Congress speak out against today. I'm very heartened to see the 17 senators that signed a letter to the administration yesterday, which I mentioned earlier. I wanted to just briefly read a few quotes actually from this administration, from the Trump administration. The first is, we continue to publicly and privately emphasize our conviction that constitutional transitions of power are essential for strong democracies everywhere, and the efforts by incumbents to change rules to stay in power weaken democratic institutions and undermine long-term stability. Another statement by this administration is that the United States is deeply concerned by the ruling of the Constitutional Tribunal to declare inapplicable provisions of the country's constitution that prohibit elected officials, including the president, from serving more than 2 consecutive terms. And a third statement. The United States is concerned with a referendum aimed at amending the Constitution through a non-transparent process. We are especially concerned that the amendments to the Constitution will be interpreted as resetting presidential term limits. Such efforts by incumbents to enact constitutional changes to remain in power beyond term limits weaken democratic institutions. I would commend the administration for all of this language, but I would note with sadness that none of this is referring to Egypt. These are comments that this Trump administration has made about 3 different countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And they're exactly right in all of these comments, and all of these comments are exactly what the White House and President Trump should be saying today to President Sisi, but sadly we have every reason to believe that they will not. But once again, despite that, there are many others who will, and we're honored to have many of them in the room here today. So thanks once again to all the co-sponsoring organizations for this event, to the members of Congress who participated, to April Corley for her powerful remarks by video, to all of you for attending and showing interest in this issue, and also to my colleagues at POMED who worked very hard to put on this event on relatively short notice. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thanks.